and relies.
Thank you. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our second session of Town Council Budget Conversations. Let us begin by acknowledging that we gather today with Martin, the ancestral presence and future change of the Bima people. Today we gather with the intent followed by the living peace and precious treaties with respect for cooperation and coexistence. You have an agenda in front of you, Council, as you wish.
You can approve this separately.
Moved by Councilor Mana, seconded by Councilor Lawrence Croft. On the question, all in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you. Just a little bit of a heads up that during the session we probably might be going into closed sessions. Implemented to the budget process based on each budget item we're discussing. We'll give you folks an advance warning that we'll be doing that. So if you happen to see breakages in our transmission, that's the reason. Finance manager, you ready for us?
Yes, so thank you very much. So how do we want to, I wanted to discuss how we want to go about this, and I'm sure the CAO probably has an idea too, but is this something we want to go around the table and get everyone's perceptions on where the budget is right now?
We actually have operating general, we have operating specific to fire, water, electrical, and cemetery. And then we also have capital budgets across that whole area. And so we're just wanting to essentially say it makes sense for the detailed discussions to pick each of those, presumably starting with them and operating, and have conversations about each of them. But beforehand, do we want to have an opportunity, as I think we often have in prior years, for councilors to share general thoughts about the overall budget and the overall context for the budget? And then if everyone's in agreement with doing that, we go around the table and then we can move into specific discussion of the general operating budget. I guess I'd like to prioritize the general operating budget because there are a few items in there that we might need to change, and we'd like to bring an updated draft to you next week. Whereas the capital budget changes can almost be accomplished simply with a strike of a pen, or, it's a lot simpler to edit. So that'd be my pitch. If people want to do the initial impressions, we do that, and then we move into discussion on town general operating, and then likely have a closed session with respect to town general operating at the end of the town general operating conversation.
Sounds like a plan to me, unless somebody has a point of view.
No, I think we should go through the operating first, but I do have a notion that I'd like to present today in regard to the capital budget for the fire department. So I'd like to get into that debate so we get that motion passed.
Okay.
If you want to regarding the side by side that the fire department was.
It's a very supportable motion, but because we're in a hurry to get it, we thought maybe it could come today as opposed to later in the process. And let's see what everybody thinks when the time comes.
Deputy Mayor, just thematically, I think, the budget, we're starting from a much more mature place than I think we have in the past few years, actually. So, I think it's really helping us kind of get to where we need to be. Just the two thoughts I have, just as we do the roundtable on initial thoughts before we dive in deep on the line items. I'm a little concerned about the lack of formality between our inevitable requirement to actually provide funding for the water utility to finance that deficit. And I guess my gut would say that it might behoove us to take a more critical lens on operating line items so that we can actually free up funding that we can formally and by council motion move almost like a loan between town general and the water utility to fund the inevitable water utility deficit. So I know we don't necessarily need to litigate it on this call, but it's the more I review the numbers and the more I kind of contemplate it, it's not clear to me that the water utility can be financed through the water rate base, just because of the gap between the revenue and the requirements of running it until we grow into it. So like, I know we have a fixed deficit booked next year, which is no surprise to anyone around the room. But with the materiality of the capital investment required, it's just like, I don't know if it really behooves us to think that we're going to solve all of the water utilities challenges through an application of URB for higher water rates. Like, I think even if the URB generously supported our application, it's going to be dwarfed and overcome by the capital investment. So just think it might behoove us to structurally say, we're going to have a $250,000 loan between the town general and the water utility to close the operating deficit. But to do that, we need to fund the operating surplus from which to draw down upon. And of course, this budget, while it's pretty lean, and I shared with Councilor Carver the other day that this is the first budget that I've seen in my time on council where we actually have many line items with lower spending in this fiscal year than the previous one. And that's a real illustration of people's attention to detail. So I'm really happy with that. But anyway, so that's sort of a thought. So I guess CAO and my thinking is just not to scrutinize every line item down to a micromanagement level, but really thematically I think we need to free up some funds so that we can formalize the transfer of funds between town general and the water utility. Anyway.
Can I supplement
Yes.
real quick? I just wanted to say that, and I mentioned this in my presentation last week, that even though we are gonna go for a rate study, it won't even be active until the last quarter of this year coming. So it's to Joe's point, there's still a huge gap there. So it's a great point. So thank you for that.
And just to point out that that is also how it's been factored into the numbers.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. The
yeah,
numbers
the
reflect
numbers
that.
kicking in Only in the fourth quarter.
Yep.
And, you know, we'll note in the budget that right now, water is essentially drawing on its own depreciation reserve
Yeah.
to cover its operating deficits.
Mhm.
But obviously, should it need to be, the depreciation reserve should be whole. So, you know, ultimately, we should probably look at loaning funds to plug that gap from somewhere else. So I think it's a good point, something that we can talk about.
So I guess the question I have, for Councilor Payne is, do you have ideas that you want to put on the table? You need some, micromanaging experience or too much ideas that probably starting.
Well, I'm on the operating side. So. I mean, there's no home run, there's no silver bullet, but I think, you know, there's always a debate about whether you should just let the program run and find out where we are based on actuals versus actually taking the razor blade right to the line item now. So, I mean, we've done quite well historically by not trying to create the operating surplus in May. But I think if we go through the line items, I'm hoping that we'll find a few things that we can agree on. There are possibilities for deferral.
And the biggest challenge, and we may have to circle back around to it in a couple of months' time, is not having a good understanding of the operating reserve balance. Like, I mean, normally you'd like to say, well, we've got operating reserve, so let's take $250,000 out of the operating reserve and we'll make that available, you know, no impact on current year. But of course, the issue with that is we don't really know 100% that the operating balance is there for that. Like, we know what's in here is we can back up what's in here, but what's in here is probably an understatement, you know, most likely of the operating reserve.
What I'm most interested in is making sure that we don't have concentric circles of mandates. We have a number of different mandates who have different stakeholder groups. Fire as a distinct group from water, from power, from town general. And right now, whenever we run into challenges across any of the stakeholder groups, we've been relying on town general to foot the bill. We certainly saw that for the solar garden, fair enough. But I think we need to formalize the relationship between town general that is funded purely through property tax and these other entities. And so if we're going to essentially subsidize the water utility, which is what we're going to, I think, inevitably have to do, we just need to make sure that the compensation for that is fair. So there needs to be a formal loan with an interest rate. And I'm not saying that this is going to be resolved in 1 year or even 2 years, but in the fullness of time, if we draw down on the perpetual care fund to fund the fire truck, for example, I mean, there should be compensation. We talked about that at the last meeting. There should be compensation back to the perpetual care fund in the form of interest along those liabilities. That's all I'm suggesting, is that we should figure out how to formalize the transfer amount and then make sure that there is compensation for the funders.
Yeah. Overall comments in the budget?
No, I'm just happy to be present and not on Zoom, that I can read the faces around the room and.
Yeah.
And see it. Yeah, it's quite a difference, so I may be quiet on the commentary because I don't feel like I have the same scope as all of you.
So, to Joe's point, we will have to talk about what the, revenue generated by having funds in the bank is, if we just leave funds in the bank, and then presumably have a bit of a guideline from there as to what the interest we want to substitute out would be, and then you just end up in the strategic conversation of who do you give a better deal to, the recipient of the loan or the loaning party, and will we make that consistent or make that, dependent on if it's perpetual care loaning to fire, or if it's town general loaning to water, or, whatever.
Yeah.
Are we gonna, have a consistent basis for the determination of interest? Or allow that to be, each loan has its own characteristics depending on what is advantageous to those departments. But we can come back around to that as we get more fiscal services section.
I think it's a good enough budget to start things on.
Mhm.
We can start having that conversation.
Okay, so, do we want to start at the begin? I know, I'm not sure, we don't want to go line by line, but do we want to go sort of section by section, total revenue, take a look at that, discuss any points that anyone has that may,
I think it makes sense to essentially sheet by sheet.
yeah, okay, perfect. So, I think the main point in the revenue section, obviously, is the assessment and the fact that we have increased, not on this sheet, but the fire rate by 0.5 cent, but we've decreased the tax rate by 0.5 cent. So that is,
But just to remind the page number.
oh, sorry, I'm on my Excel right now. Sorry, yep, no. So
Page 5.
page 5, yes, Joe's are pretty good at helping with this. Page 3 and 5. I guess, yeah. So are there any questions in regards to that? So this was discussed a little bit last week. We've discussed it in prior council meetings, but I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that the overall tax rate has not changed because we've increased the fire, but we've reduced the property.
And I think it's reasonable to point out here that in terms of the calculation of the fire rate, actually has been doing some work behind the scenes to determine where the fire rate needs to be. And we had said that we would include a note on that, and it wasn't in the original draft. We have circulated a note on that since, it'll be included in the next draft of the budget.
Yeah.
But as everyone knows, and I think as staff have been saying for a number of years, 0.5, half a cent is really, less than the annual level of increase that we're currently anticipating would be needed to support the capital program that we're looking at over the next 10 years.
Mhm.
So council will have to consider, if in this year we feel 0.5 cent is sufficient. But the guidance that we're looking at this point is to say it probably should be 1.2 cents. Are we willing to change that this year, or will we just simply consider that next year we're 1.9 cents behind because we didn't do, the full 1.2 this year? And that's just based on the projected capital more than anything.
Yeah.
Knowing that we need to stay ahead of the next fire truck that arrives and needs a loan to cover it.
Mhm.
Exactly. And I guess the question for me there would be, if we go to 1.2, what does that do to effectiveness? And that we need to not create a shock.
With respect to the outside areas also, yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, we have the outside areas rated for the whole MODL, and we still remain in certainly the lower, section of that. The real, we talked about this before, the real distinction is that the adjacent areas on, the Lunenburg side of town are the lowest, and so the regional norm is a low rate, whereas in the whole county, our rates are some of the lower. So, if viewed from the angle of people in Mayor's Cove, I would think they would be a little more sensitive to rate increase. If viewed from people on the other side of town in Oakland, and they're looking at the rates in our river, their rates are lower, so but they're all the same as our rates, so we have to kind of consider that on some sides of us, we have different levels of competition. We also, we say it's competition, but there's no significant history of these things moving based on the, annual price. We've been providing services to Mayor's Cove, I think, since their commission, since they ceased to have an active fire.
He actually has a bit.
So, hopefully that wouldn't change, but the other thing to consider is with the in-town rate, if we wanted to do that 1.2 instead of 0.5, then if we still want to keep it equalized, we'd have to find room to further reduce the town general rate to keep that level. And that's a challenge in and of itself, or there'd be a resulting net increase. But, we maybe find to say 0.5 because that's at least, moving the thing in the right direction. But I think it's just important to note that, this isn't coming out of nowhere, and in fact, the analysis says it probably should be at 1.2. Increase.
So like I was pretty comfortable with viewing this in the lens of a multi-year conversation with our friends in the district. And knowing that to a large degree, the tide will lift all boats, both in town and Blockhouse and Indian Point, Oakland. Look, I don't think our cost structure is changing is going to be any different than Lunenburg's, or that there's anything demonstrably different between Lunenburg's decision to charge what they charge and what we charge. It's just, it's not clear to me how they can provide that service at 6 cents, 6.5 cents, or but on the other hand, in Blockhouse, there it's 16 cents. So I mean, so we're kind of right in the middle at 11 cents. And I think it's a pretty comfortable place to be compared to the comparisons. So I thought that that fire rate was a pretty good compromise, and I know there's been some correspondence back and forth between some of those ratepayers, but it's generally, from my observation, been positive.
Okay. And the difference between ours and the district of 1 and 2, which provides, Lunenburg provides that, is that they have such a large area, and it depends on how the budget goes. Because they have different types of arrangements with those districts than we have with that.
Maybe it's a case of we've done something this year. But we next year we have to do something different. But I think it's a good note to just have that narrative so it comes back decision next year.
Yeah.
You're going to be here, right? This year we need it to be, will change down this year, and then next year will be another. And at some point, it's a lot of time to something strategy.
And, when you're doing 10-year projection, it is difficult. It may be that sometime in the next 10 years, external funding to share in fire department vehicle purchase cost becomes available. And, that wildly changes the expectation that we will have no external funding to contribute to this actual cost. So, yeah. All right, well, if nobody else has anything further to say, we acknowledge that note wasn't included in the original draft. It will be included in the next draft. And it will show that we're doing a 0.5. Maybe we need to consider 1.2. We'll return to that discussion next year.
Okay. One thing I did want to ask is, if we could discuss the infrastructure charge. It's right now status quo at 300. Basically for my own benefit, we have tax bills going out soon. So if that's something that we could discuss, that would be helpful for us because the timing of it, we either have to push it to the second billing or keep it now. So, yeah, so if we could discuss that as well when we're talking about all these rates, that would be wonderful.
If I could just put a quick spin on the infrastructure charge, because we haven't recommended changing it, but I just think we just talked about how the fire charge is used and why it needs to be what it would need to be. So with respect to the infrastructure charge, it's worth pointing out that we have no wastewater rate. So while the water utility rate is intended, and we've talked about this, we'll get water utility to cover future capital purchases that the water utility will make, and that includes big line upgrades that are happening to the town, very necessary after a century-old water system here. The wastewater component of those upgrades, which is typically at least the same equivalent amount in water, doesn't have any rate associated with it. It's covered off of taxes. And we use the infrastructure charge for various types of capital infrastructure, but included in that is wastewater. And if you just simply look at wastewater alone, the infrastructure charge is not sufficient to keep pace with just the wastewater capital investments that are planned in the next 10 years. So that doesn't include sidewalks, doesn't include recreational facilities, doesn't include anything else. We have talked over the years about the wisdom of creating a separate wastewater charge so that it wouldn't be a flat charge, so that it would be a consumption-based charge, and it would be charged to the people who receive wastewater service. But at this point, the infrastructure charge is our only dedicated capital funding mechanism for wastewater. So just on that note, it is quite a bit below where it probably would need to be had we gone through the process to set a wastewater rate and dedicate wastewater capital funding from that. But that doesn't mean we're recommending a change in it, but it, we all should acknowledge that it is not a currently sufficient level to fund all the capital that it would arguably be expected to contribute to. But it's never been funded.
So you're saying, Dylan, that of the traditional revenue sources specifically allocated towards capital, deed transfer tax, infrastructure tax, dividend from the subsidiary, and gas tax, or whatever we call the gas tax now. It's got a new, more socially correct name, but anyway, gas tax. You're right. So those funds, those funds are the source that we fund the reserves, one of which is the wastewater reserve that we set up, and the equipment reserve, and a number of other things that we've increased. So, I mean, I believe that the council is sending a message around around a level of stewardship around lowering the tax rate by 0.5%. I believe we'll be the only municipality in the province doing that. I think that's a really strong message compared to our friends in Halifax who are increasing the rate by 8%. So things are more expensive. That's just the reality. I also think that the virtues of the infrastructure tax is it's fair. It's a form of flat tax. It's been in the town for almost 20 years, I believe. Look, I think it's a fair and equitable tax. And you can see where the proceeds go. There's a direct correlation to the public works that happens around town and the capital infrastructure. So I think I'm open-minded about increasing it modestly. I think in the 7 years I've been on council, it's gone up $25, I believe. We went from a $275 base to a $300 base several years ago. Like I do think that periodically we'd be better off if we adjusted it modestly by $5 or $10, which would generate $5,000 or $10,000 a year. But that $5,000 or $10,000 is generally going to get a triple multiplier because of our funding sources. So 10,000 equals 30,000 with our municipal and federal partners helping us. I don't know. I'm open-minded about a modest increase to that fee, knowing that we're talking plus or minus $20 per home per year. Doesn't strike me that is far offset by the 0.5% decrease, I believe, for most households. So even including a modest increase of infrastructure fee, I think the vast majority of homes will receive an actual reduction in property tax percentage. Percentage. No, fair enough. Yeah. What are your thoughts around that? I know it's not universally loved, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't know.
Fair enough. I don't hold that against you, credits.
Yeah. I think just curious about, you can probably because it predates me in the council about why we didn't go with the wastewater tax, a rate in and of itself separately. And then primarily for me, that's a case of with this tax, it goes to everybody. So people who do not enjoy the benefits of wastewater are still, are still getting hit. So if we're wanting to increase it from the basis of just wastewater, then why not do that separately? And maybe not this year, I don't think we'll be able to do that, but maybe going forward, have something that can be considered like council. And maybe there's something historically that prevented that from happening, because that would be a fair tax. So it's
Like a wastewater.
yeah.
I mean, I guess one thing to consider with that is if we did increase the infrastructure charge at all. I would suggest that regardless of what infrastructure charge is, if it's $300, if it's more than $300. That if a council next year or subsequently did institute a wastewater charge. You would want to reduce the infrastructure charge. Or at least contemplate how breaking out the wastewater component of it.
Yeah.
Could result in a corresponding reduction of wastewater charge. So in that way, increasing it now doesn't really like in any way interfere with the possibility of lowering it later in a separate wastewater charge.
Fair enough, but just be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Right, because if you eliminate the infrastructure charge, which I agree is unusual and unique to Mon Bay. That $300,000 will come out of the tax base. Will have to come out of increased revenue. So 300,000 on 2.8 million, that's an 8% tax rate increase. To replace, like, so the infrastructure charge is a material contribution to the town's revenue. So if we tinker with it, like, I'm open-minded about reviewing that, but I think it's a much more complicated conversation because the messaging to the town would be your infrastructure charges going away, which I think most people would say, well, I hated paying that anyway. But oh yeah, by the way, your dollar, what's our tax rate proposed? 115? Our proposed tax rate of 1.10 is now 120. Because we need a dime, we'd need 10 cents to recover that same amount of tax. And so it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul. But it's certainly a changing thematically, it's a difference because then you'd be saying assessments going up and property tax rates are going up.
But I wouldn't put it that way. I would say you're looking at the wastewater rate, that would be a rate that would be charged to people who will enjoy wastewater services, right?
Well, that's another 10 cents.
Whether they enjoy them or not, they receive them.
Yeah.
Now,
But on the other side of the coin, if you take away this charge altogether, that also funds the sidewalks, et cetera, does it not?
No, I wasn't
No.
taking it out altogether.
No.
This is
I'm not-
incremental.
but yeah, I wasn't proposing that. I was saying, if you're going to think about raising it from wastewater. The fair thing would be actually to raise it for folks who are enjoying using the service per se.
I agree with that, I'm just
Yeah.
wondering about how do we do the other infrastructure, but if we keep it in there at a lower rate, that's fine.
well, just so you understand, if we eliminate this fee, if we eliminate the fee. Like the distortion on the taxes will happen to the same effect that it's already happening on cap. So not everybody in town is gonna get a $300 savings. I'm talking 300, some people will receive $300, other people will get a $700 increase. Because of the assessments and the cap assessment and the distortion of how you have two neighbors next to one another, they have the exact same value. They all receive the same benefit. One person's assessment is dramatically higher because they don't have the cap. So like, I just think there's a technical reality of the flat tax and how everybody in town is accustomed to paying for it. But if we eliminate it, there'll be absolute winners and losers, and anyone who doesn't enjoy a big cap will be a loser. And
But where did you get the notion that I was saying eliminate? I haven't said eliminate in any of my. I said I don't like it.
fair,
Fair. I haven't said eliminate it at all. I'm just saying. In fact, I was asking a question before, is that maybe there was a conversation about why we did not get a rate for stormwater, for wastewater. Initially, maybe they had the conversations and there was a reason why.
I can't speak, I know in other communities, it's usually because water services aren't metered or a large part of the community is served by one water or not wastewater or vice versa.
Yeah,
But in our case, they are metered and almost everybody is served by both, so,
yeah.
I'm not sure why we wouldn't have done that years ago, but.
And is anything preventing us from doing?
No, Bridgewater just did it
Mhm.
a year ago, so it's certainly possible.
And so I would propose that we leave this as is. And figure out a rate, that doesn't have to be for this budget, we can't go with for this budget. But figure out a rate for wastewater going forward and then adjust the infrastructure charge.
Mhm.
But I will say, this council has approved us to go out and do a wastewater rate study and come back with that information.
Yeah.
We just have been so focused on the ones that are supporting existing rates that we haven't gotten to the wastewater rate study yet. And unfortunately, we need updated audited statements to really conduct the wastewater study, so. If this council would want to support the wastewater rate study being completed and available to the next council. Then I guess I would suggest that we had previously said it was about $10,000 as an operating initiative. To at least equip the next council with a wastewater rate study. And I still feel that that is something that we could easily accomplish. Once we eventually have got our audits up to date and complete the rate studies for the rates that exist today.
Water and everything else.
So, whether that's something, it's not in the budget
No.
right now, whether that's something we want to have in the budget, going forward, or whether we just want to let it be part of next year's budget if the next council is seriously contemplating a wastewater rate. We wouldn't get to it, I think, probably until fourth quarter anyway at this point.
Well, Eric, I think you now understand why this rate has only changed once in 22 years. It's our conversation. Anyway,
I see that. for sure.
inflation. Oh, well, we'll keep this. Fair enough, Deputy Mayor. I think,
My proposal would be keep it as is.
Yeah.
If we want to change it, let's find a rate study
okay,
and have the next council deal with changing.
So that would be to include the 10,000 in this budget.
Yes.
Okay.
So does that mean?
So that's the kind of thing where, we should talk about at the beginning. If we want to revise the draft budget, I do think, as we've done in prior years, that the best thing to do is get motions to revise the draft budget to
Mhm.
include something or not include something or change something. So I would say yes, if we want to see a version of the draft budget with that in it, somebody should make a motion that actually revise the draft budget accordingly, and then we'll see it next week in context with all the other changes.
So moved.
And Eric, did you do that?
That we amend the budget to include a rate study at 10,000.
Wastewater.
Wastewater study.
Wastewater rates.
I thought we already approved.
We didn't spend it because we never had time, so.
But it's
Uh-huh.
still change to spend it.
Uh-huh.
So is there a second?
Second for the motion. Second by Councilor King.
And I was like, last time it was supposed to be funded from operating reserve, we never spent it, so, originally, I think we might present it as being from operating reserve again.
Any questions? All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you.
Just before we toggle off of revenue, are we legislatively precluded from doing any other further adjustments to the transfer tax?
Yes, this is the.
We are at-
Yeah.
And that's provincial legislation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have more money.
Well, I'm just curious, as the first town in the province to ever implement it, I don't mind being a trendsetter then. Okay, thank you, Ashley. So are we kind of locked down on revenue? I guess Deputy Mayor, that's where you're heading? or-
Yes, I believe so.
I think so too.
Great. Thumbs up, okay. So. Let me find the page number, or we're gonna go to the general,
Lucky we've got that $90 in sale of merchandise.
that'll cover it all, don't worry.
Pardon me, just one point of clarification at our last meeting.
Yeah.
So we had the full cost of the power being generated from Solar Garden in the electrical cost. But where's the corresponding revenue for the payment from the electrical utility back to the town? Like, is that in the equation yet?
It's a good question, and no, it's not.
Okay,
Yeah.
we can leave that.
It's kind of
As soon
assumed
as-
in Nano.
As soon as
Essentially,
that
because
payment.
this is the first year, we don't really have a great understanding of either the cost or the capacity of the solar garden to deliver on estimated production. So we just thought better to keep it conservative and not estimate anything, but if there was anything, it would end up essentially as a dividend line going to fund capital, as we've done with any proceeds from other sites of the year. So that is my expectation.
Okay. Okay. That sounds reasonable, but we must have, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Lot of-
So
lot of assets.
it'll give us a higher capital reserve balance at the end of the year, we just don't know how much higher. Until we have a sense whether we actually produce what we thought we would, and what it really costs to produce it.
Mhm.
And then after we've had this year, where we're trying to go to the board and sort all that out, and we'll have a much better picture of what percentage of them is what had a year.
Okay,
Okay, so moving on to page 17. There will be some discussion in closed session on the salaries and benefits, so I don't think we need to get too much into that right now. If anybody has any general questions, by all means. Does anybody have any questions in regards to any of the line items on this?
This is general government services.
Yeah.
I guess you could say, yeah, other than expenditures.
Yeah.
And the first section is legislative, which is the council services specifically.
Council services, and in addition to it would be the election specific expenses this year.
You see a pretty huge year-over-year increase on the legislative side, but these are one time every council term.
Every-
cost.
Yeah.
every 4 years.
And in some cases, we would show them as a transfer from operating reserve, but we didn't feel it was necessary to do that this year. Right, obviously, if we come up in a deficit unexpectedly, we could
That could be
transfer from operating to cover it, but we didn't plan to do that.
Yeah, and as I noted, the new council, their computers are not in those numbers. They will be
They're in the
down.
budget.
They're in the budget. They'll be down in the MJSB number. So it's about $1,500 per computer per council member. So just keep that in mind that there is a little bit more for a new council coming in expense wise.
The only note I had on that page, Ashley, was the CPI math that you were using.
Yeah.
What number are we using? Official.
4.9.
Is that like an official, is that just a budget estimate or is that an actual,
That is an average of,
like, what do we,
I have it saved down. I don't have it right in front of me, but that is an average of what other municipalities were using, other towns were using. As well as just looking at sort of the trending a monthly average for, so.
so when we have remuneration packages that are aligned to CPI increases, are we, like, do we have a policy on which of the multitude of CPIs we're using? And like, do we align that with the property tax assessment CPI that factors into the cap, or are we just randomly? Like, do we have an official policy around which CPI number we use?
No, I don't believe we do so.
No, we have traditionally used provincial CPI more than federal CPI, but yeah, this is not, I guess, the provincial looks like maybe it's slightly less than 4%.
I was just thinking like our revenue stream is driven off of the CPI number that's used for the cap.
Mhm.
And I would have thought that we would have tried to align our expenses with a similar percentage, but anyway.
But that's a good point. That's something we can certainly look at, to kind of balance those a little bit more in the future. The CPI is obviously, it's an average.
I thought the cap was 3.1. The cap,
So it should say 3.3.
yeah, so there's like 0.7 on $2 million is real money, like, so if we're trying to, I'm just thinking, in the interest, I don't want to anyway, preaching the converted here, whatever you guys think we should do, Ford seemed like it was a big CPI number relative to the revenue we get through the cap, and maybe, I'm
I
not
think what would
sure.
make the most sense if people would be agreeable to this is that we have, when we get to closed session, some discussion of some personnel items and then. Consider whether we drop the CPI to 3.3. If those other items can be, agreed upon, so we can just come back to CPI later on after we've had that discussion.
And
Because obviously a lot of it related.
the only reason
Other
it's remaining,
compensation increases on CPI.
because I think we've put, so we're fixing on this revenue stream. And so really, we're just trying to estimate the operating budget. Because we need a bigger operating surplus because we have to fund the liability in the water utility.
Mhm.
Amongst other pressures.
Well, it's an interesting question. I had assumed
Hmm.
whatever rate was being used was consistent all through, so on the
Yeah.
stuff that we have revenue have a different.
No, listen, that's a fair point. Now, I know when I went and I discussed with other towns around here, I actually picked a lower value than what they were proposing in their budget, so.
Hmm.
I think it's very subjective.
Yeah.
It also depends on whether you use a calendar year average or, exactly, so it is, but I do take your point, and that is a valid point, so I am more than open to changing it. Especially if we're looking at reducing expenses, that might be one of the options that we have, so that's.
The calendar year is a good point, because I was just looking at the March numbers, and when we started the draft budget, we were using December.
Yeah,
Numbers, and I think that probably was closer to 4.
yeah,
The inflation dropped off in the fourth quarter, and so the actual March numbers.
So I'm sure the council, I think, would fully support, any driver of benefit driven off CPI. We want that fairly provided to all the employees. Like, this isn't we want to use a lower CPI to reduce our salaries.
yeah, no, but it has to
I'm
be
just thinking
justified.
there needs to be some methodology that will
Mhm.
last more than year to year, depending on who is looking at it.
Yeah.
And, I think there's so many versions of the
Yeah.
calculation.
Yeah.
All I'm suggesting was, let's just figure out what version we're gonna use, and from some kind of a policy statement, say, this is our math.
That would
This
make
is-
my job easier,
Yeah,
because right now I
yeah.
kind of survey all our fellow towns and I do my calcs and then I kind
Mhm.
of figure out what seems to be. What's the average? So I mean, if we want to have a specific formula, we use this, we use a calendar date. I'm all for that. That takes a lot of guesswork.
So calendar base 2023 was 4.
Hmm,
So like that was the calendar average CPI for Nova Scotia, all items from December to December.
yeah,
Or January to December, so 3.3 would be the March to March number.
mhm.
So, we just have to be consistent, and not.
Yeah, if I love a good policy,
Let's just
so.
leave that, just
I
leave
think
that.
we need to go back and
with-
see what we did last time as well.
Yeah, absolutely, but,
Yeah.
It's a good point, and I think a policy would be great, actually.
So,
Just a small question, it's about the council's remuneration line.
Mhm.
And given that the remuneration is under review at this point, and there may possibly be a recommendation for an increase, could council approve it? I'm just wondering if there should be a cushion built in for the possibility or not.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and we sort of discussed this yesterday. The committee just had its first meeting this week, actually, Tuesday. And no actual specific discussions have even started on that yet. We're still collecting data and asking for like a wish list of data so that we can talk about it. I say we, I'm not a non-voting member, I'm just there to support, but, so when I grappled over this because I don't know I honestly don't know, because there hasn't even really been discussions from the committee yet, so I don't know if the committee is gonna recommend anything, if they do, at what level, or, or is it gonna stay status quo? Because I mean, at the end, council is the one that approves it or denies it, so I wasn't sure. I am more than happy to put in a buffer. This was my thought process, so.
Well, all of those things are possible. We don't know the outcome. The only thing we do know is that a recommendation is to come from the committee before the end of this council term. Because any change has to be made by this council
That's right.
before the next council. So that's in place. We know that. So my question still stands about whether or not there should be a buffer or a cushion built into the budget for some of that. Who knows?
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
mean,
think usually what we do with this kind of thing was that we would just say when the recommendation came forward for the committee, we'd have to consider it in the context of this approved budget. Rather than trying to put in something, especially since. It's kind of presuming that there would be a change, and we don't really know, we don't want to prejudge and tell. Anyone that, this is what we're expecting, so work within these parameters, and, so whatever number you put to it, it's hard to avoid. Interfering with that process.
and also presuming that they will implement a change that's higher than CPI. But
Yeah.
if it's within CPI, then the budget to be able to address that.
Yeah, and there's a number of different aspects of compensation, these are really talking about honorarium, but there are other possible costs in town. That could come out of that immigration conversation. I think it's best to leave it out of the draft budget and just understand that this will be the context in which you'll talk about it when it comes.
Okay, are there any more, I don't know, Dylan, did you wanna go through did you want me to go through each section, or what's council's wishes on?
which was concerning general administration.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably makes sense to get questions on. Admin and finance at the same time. I don't know that anyone would make a specific distinction, so just if anyone has any comments on the rest of the general government section. Which ends on page 21, 22.
22 notes wise,
If
yeah.
you want to go your to page 22 and the grants organization funds, we did say we would talk about that today, but if there are any other questions, I'll tell them first.
The general government, yep, you're on page 22, Dylan?
Well, I just say if there's any questions coming up to page 22, let us know, and then on page 22 is the grants line, and I did want your input on the grants line.
Page 22.
Note 6 on page 22,
Oh,
just says the grants request is 51,000. We
yes,
haven't kind of,
I think it would be,
If there's no other comment about the general government section, then this would be an open question to the group. We received $51,000 worth of applications last year.
Mhm.
We granted approximately 22,000. Do we want to grant not more than last year's grants? Do we want to be willing to consider more than that? Do we feel that the current budgetary pressures would mean that we should be doing less than we did last year? Just impressions.
Deputy Mayor, I thought, so under that line item, my understanding is the social or senior wheels. Is a subset of that 51, that $10,000 request.
Yeah.
Um,
So that's a good point. If you
So-
wanted to do that one,
so-
then consider how that affects the other.
So I thought that was a very compelling story that we had at the last council meeting when they came in with their presentation. I think we've had really good luck when we've entered into multi-year arrangements with the organization where we can provide kind of consistent funding to them in consideration for getting something back, and the getting something back in this situation would be like information about ridership levels and so on and so forth. So to be frank, I didn't really consider that $10,000 annual investment as a grant per se, like no different than the way we organize the funding the field or the funding for the museum or the Vic.
subsidy.
It's almost like a different kind of category,
Well,
so,
that's where the subsidies category has been. And
yeah,
I think if council says that you see it as a year-over-year commitment and something that we'd like to treat as a subsidy, we could move it off there.
yeah.
But I think because it's in the 51,000 now, just remember moving it off won't really reduce the impact
No.
on the budget.
No, I think when we compare year over year funding levels, 25 to 41, I think is a fair comparison of a growth of the requests. And we had a lengthy conversation about this last year, to which we made some decisions about how much we wanted to be in the weeds on it. But I do think that the points we made last year about the town of Mahone Bay and their taxpayers are not a foundation. Like, and we have a certain mandate, and we are not we shouldn't collect tax revenue and then distribute it to charities, like it shouldn't be. So I do think there's a number of line items there that I wouldn't think are priorities for us as a town to support. But also there's a few excellent funding requests that we should contemplate. What do you all think?
Go ahead, Penny.
Well, I totally support the idea of putting the Lunenburg County wheels into the subsidies category. Because I'm making some commitment that you suggest for 3 years, similar to what we've done with other, with the field, yeah. And we have been asked to come back with possible ceiling. And so at least, the very least, we should be going up the 4% minimum. But last year was 22,000. I'd like us to see us to go to 25,000. And I think that we could cover quite a few of those grants at 25,000.
So.
I'm open to,
Yeah.
like to hear discussion about that.
So just, of course, I mean, so between the two of you, you thinking of a motion to move the 10,000 into a section. So I'll come back to you.
Does it need a motion?
I'll come back to you in motion because which is.
Well,
done, and then,
I appreciate the cap, like the 25,000, but some of the grant asks are quite high. You know, some are like 10,000 and more, so, we won't cover many grants if we're giving out those large pieces of money, so if we want to be able to give more grants to more organizations, we're gonna have to really cut down. I mean, they give us a base of what they want, and usually people ask for more than what they want, because they know in the process, they often come back with less than what they ask, so they hit the high number. So we really have to scrutinize this with some of the asks that we have received.
so just for clarity, what we agreed on last time is that we as council will not scrutinize. Is that what we agreed on? That's something that's.
Well, then I'll present recommendations and then you can scrutinize from there on the starting point. Yeah, I guess that's what we.
Oh,
So if I get a number like 25,000 today, I will come back next week, the version you guys get will say 25,000, and then if you go to the appendix on the grants, it will have that recommended category with a total of 25,000 showing who would get what of each. And then you can go through and say, I think you've given too much to this one, or I don't think you've given enough to this one, or it just looks good, and there you go. I guess I just, it won't total 25 because we always like to leave 10%. It'll total 22,500 maximum, so there's a little buffer for stuff that comes in late.
My point is, and I agree that we are here to subsidize things at the taxpayer's expense. And some of these grants, they're year after year after year, I think, so I don't think they're,
they're operators.
yeah, they're, we're sort of less just operating them as part of us, so I think we have to take a serious look at that. And, I agree that maybe you should go with the $25,000 limit. And then see what the staff brings back for recommendations and take it from there, so we'll really much better about nothing.
Yeah, thanks. So just by way of comparison, I noticed that Bridgewater, for example, mentioned that they had given $200,000 in community grants. And I think that Bridgewater is about 8 times the size of Mahone Day, so $45,000 is roughly in proportion. And certainly can't act as the money for every organization. And my preference would be, in terms of prioritizing, is the ones that are absolutely essential to Mahone Bay people, to sort of keep it focused on the Mahone Bay population.
There it starts at home.
And I will note, sometimes our response might be, we're giving you less, but here's a possible alternative source of funding. I'm just, I noticed that we did this foundation request there, and there has been some discussion about the possibility of including their ask in a beautification and streetscaping program application to the province. So if we didn't give them everything they're looking for, we could support their inclusion in that application to the province, just for example. So that's very constructive.
And I think just reviewing the grants policy, that wasn't crystal clear that request could even be facilitated through the grants program.
There are a couple that are
Yeah,
questionable.
but
Yeah, we've done something questionable before.
no, fair enough.
So I agree with all, and probably last, because we don't have a recreation department. We will have, so maybe we can start to the 25. Because something like a big team or trade association, those are the recreational things that we as a town do not provide. So maybe that would probably be better from my perspective.
To fully fund the recreation grants.
And we'll have the challenge of figuring out and putting us something to break down. I would have an eye out for recreation stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give you somewhere to start and you feel free to make a couple pages, but I think if somebody wants to make a motion at 25 or 38, whatever, that's all we need today. And then once we're done with the grant part, I'd like to come back around to the wheels thing and ask, we moved it to subsidies, but did we want to move the subsidies at 10,000? but let's just confirm that as three of us. Yeah.
So 41 minus 10 plus 5. Not bad. Okay, fair enough. Pardon me, oh, no, 51 minus 10 plus, okay, fair enough.
But having heard, the CAO's reference to the cushion that they left in last year, I think I'd rather see it bumped up to 27.5 or 30, as a cap. And that would include the cushion, that's a motion.
Do you want to move on?
I'll go for 30.
Okay. Anything about that?
Yep, that staff revised the draft budget to the amount for grants to organizations to $30,000.
So do you have a second about that? Second.
And we're gonna have one more look at that
Yeah.
once.
Next.
Okay, fair
You'll
enough.
look at it with the actual recommendations for each
Uh-huh.
organization fleshed out, and then you can decide on it.
And feel free to line something out that's completely inappropriate too, don't feel the need to bring every line prorated back. Dylan.
Yeah, we don't really
Use
have a thing
your-
where everybody gets something. that we
You know-
often said no, just.
No.
You know the themes coming from the table well, so.
On the,
Oh, the question.
on the
Oh,
first.
I guess if I've said before, and the deputy there has also stated some principles, recreation and homegrown, local. And despite the comment about the repetitive aspect of some of the requests, but at least two or three of them are ones that we have traditionally partnered on in the community. So they've been kind of town community group partnerships. So I want to be sure that those, I'm all in favor of giving those ones as the full request if we can. And
On the question? All in favor? You just carried. Something that I missed. Did you do it?
You know, the subsidy or? I would say it would be a good idea to have, now that we've set the grants budget, I would say the subsidy motion should probably be. That a subsidy in the amount of X, whatever it is.
Yeah.
To the South Shore Wheels be included in, or to Woodward County Wheels, be included in the draft 24-25 budget. So it's just not related at all to the grant anymore, yeah.
And also how many years we want to. get done.
Three
Okay,
years.
so you have the motion?
So I move the council direct staff to enter into a 3-year agreement with the South Shore Senior Wheels Organization to provide stable funding in the amount of $10,000 per fiscal year for the next 3 fiscal years. And I guess I think that's the motion.
Yeah.
I think the actual name is Lunenburg County.
Lunenburg County. Yeah.
And moved by Joe, seconded by Penny.
Mhm,
Let's get the same thing started with the fix the name.
Yeah.
We'll get the right name in a minute.
mhm.
On the question? All in favor? Motion is carried. Did you put in a motion from the wastewater rate study?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought we need the. I forget some things.
And with that, I was reading all the motions are going to exactly that.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Knock the grants down by 21, added another 10, added another 10, it was $1,000 off of it.
We're not having.
Still.
Well, it's.
Well, yeah.
Balance budget all right.
Yeah.
You couldn't add too much.
But I mean,
Okay, moving on. What did you ask?
Okay, so are we,
We're in general government.
we're to general government? Okay, let me grab my paper copy and make sure I'm on the same page as everybody else. So we're going into other protective services.
I think protectors.
Is it protective?
First in our.
Oh, 23, page 23, sorry, I meant flipped. So page 23, so this would include,
24, I don't know why I was here.
Bill Hall. 23 months.
I'm not sure
Oh,
why.
I'm 23.
What do you think? Well, I could hear.
I'm looking at,
You're 23?
we might have old versions.
Yeah, that's very strange.
I'm
How confident do you feel right now?
I'm with Francis, I'm looking at the one we sent out, anyway, you're 23, 24, depending on your title protected services. If you're looking at our notes, you know.
It's all 23 and 24.
She's really picking it up or not, I don't know, as long as you're looking at protected services.
24 is other protective service.
Yeah,
23 is.
Okay, 23 is the one you're gonna want.
Yeah.
sorry about that.
I don't know.
I don't wanna- So, okay, under protective services, so we have the RCMP, and as I noted, I don't have the exact estimate for that, so I did my best guess on what it will be, based on trends in prior years.
Is that actually based on this new contract? Or is this?
We're right at the midpoint of the existing contract, well, okay, so the contract we have is with the province.
Right,
There are some changes going on, obviously, within the federal government and activity compensation and back pay and all of this kind of stuff. What we've been kind of given from the province is the notion that they would come back to us if there is going to be any impact from any of that, but they have not, at this point, confirmed that they're passing it on to us or put a number on it. So, yeah, at this point, we've just been going with like the PTSA, we're in the middle of a 20-year term. It's been fairly predictable increases, they're not small, but they've been pretty predictable, but it doesn't consider the compensation settlement of issues at the federal level. That's-
Yeah.
I think it's,
I thought there was an announcement that the federal government is the one that will take the heat on the back.
Well, that would be exciting.
great,
There is a meeting scheduled for Monday that Eric and I plan to attend down in Queens, that the province is scheduled to provide updates on the provincial police services contract and its relationship to the RCMP federal costs, so maybe they're gonna tell us all about that, and so we'll come back and we'll still be in our budget process if they do tell us anything relevant.
I found it very disappointing that meeting they had the day of the conference opening about policing.
Yeah,
I think it was very misleading.
I really thought, if I went to it, and I wasn't even attending the conference, I really thought I was going to hear this news, so it wasn't anything.
And I found that really disappointing, and I thought we would have more input in some decision making. You know, and that, is there yet a municipal person on this board now, or that seemed to be one of the biggest issues, is there was no representation from municipalities making decisions on what we are going to be paying out.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that appointment has been confirmed at this point. And even when I said that, Louis represented the units, the municipal units directly to Ottawa. So even when we had that link, which Louis is the former CAO of Town Winter, when we had that link, but it was only with respect to Ottawa. And the province appointed a new liaison between the provincial PPSA Justice Service and the municipalities. And that's the person who's coordinated this meeting for Monday. But I'm really at a loss as to the political level, staff level thing, because like typically you'd have some involvement at the NSFM political level, and then you'd also have some involvement at the staff level. And in a lot of areas, the province has shown a tendency to minimize the political level interface in favor of the staff level one, over the last number of years. I guess we'll find out on Monday, you know, if that's a substantive announcement. I would have said it should have gone to the NSFM first, before the CIOs, but I kind of doubt it's a substantive, I kind of expect it'll sort of go waste a couple of hours hearing the same stuff we heard last fall. But as soon as we have any kind of, you know, angle on what the costs are gonna be, I mean, we're in the PPSA, so we're just a receiver of costs.
so are there any other questions on the protective services page?
Yeah, you will know we've doubled the bylaw enforcement officer from last year's actuals. We had already done a 50% increase in the budget last year based on the assumption that the noise bylaw would go through, and since it wasn't, we didn't actually spend that, so the actual stayed pretty much right on the prior year. So now we're expecting with 2 pending enforcement bylaws, and we're expecting an even further increase, so we've got intention of doubling. Ultimately, I do not know how this will shake out in terms of staff.
Yeah,
Like, you've already shown the challenges of, you know, who can you get to respond to after hours calls? Who can you get to do going around marking tires? You know, the nuance level of enforcement that Al's been providing is great value add because we've got a retired provincial inspector. But he's not necessarily the right person, nor does he necessarily have the time to do the tire marking or show up in the middle of the night to a noise call. So we're probably gonna transition the way we do bylaw enforcement over the next couple of years, and we're just gonna have to. You know, best guesses along the way from a budgetary perspective. We'll come back to council if we have a recommendation on hiring a new person and how that would look. For now, we just want to make sure that it doesn't come as a complete financial shock.
Yeah.
The new bylaws will have associated enforcement costs.
Mhm.
Um. Just curious, the town of Lunenburg went to people more than last year. Was it last year or the year before?
They were gonna contact Bridgewater,
Did they go ahead with that? or-
I don't know who that would be, but we can find out.
So Jonathan now can do citations, right?
Mhm.
So is that is that part of his already salary, or is he,
He's not getting anything additional
He's
for that,
not
but we're
getting
really not asking.
So
him,
this
it's like
extra
we said,
person-
We're really only asking him
Okay.
to use it as it relates to the public works department's work. So it's mostly for people instructing snow clearing.
oh,
which is what-
sure,
Now, if he notices someone parked illegally, he does have the ability to issue a ticket, as far as I understand it, so that is something we may opportunistically do. I know I don't have the ability to issue a ticket, I happen to have warning tickets, I'm gonna opportunistically issue those warning tickets when I can, I do. So I guess it's just down to, you
Personalities,
have the opportunity.
yeah.
If I see it, I'm gonna put a warning ticket on, they should be glad I saw it and not out of trust.
Do you have that authority as parking, as traffic authority or as CAO?
Well, just as CAO, because I can't issue a ticket.
Oh,
You have to
you
be
can't issue a
special,
warning.
yes, I can issue a warning, but.
Okay.
If we ever did issue a ticket, and if the ticket ever came with a fine, and if we ever were able to enforce the fine, like, how does that happen? Is that, if we don't have any revenue for increased fines recovered,
No,
right?
Well,
So,
I mean, we get a little bit of fines, we get a little bit of revenue, but it's. very little.
not,
Yeah.
yeah, I
not,
wouldn't,
it's not full cost.
You got $1,200 or something in the revenue side, but no, I mean, none of these things are money makers.
Yeah,
Obviously,
yeah,
our goal is
well-
not to actually get to the point where we have to issue a ticket or have someone pay a ticket.
Fair enough.
Parking tickets are one thing, we will issue parking tickets, they're very small, people generally pay them. Anything larger than that, you're into the hundreds of dollars, we would really prefer not to have to issue those. And as you know, we've issued them twice in the past year, and we recently we've gone back and rescinded one of them, so we really don't do a lot of those tickets. And, you know, if it's contested, you end up with small claims court and you should pay.
Just as long as we have a policy that says council cannot rescind a ticket. Like, let's get that up front right now. before we start
don't, not big.
It's actually worth mentioning
Right,
too, that
like-
even if we determine that a similar offense ticket was issued in error, it's a substantial process to convince the province that it was.
Yeah.
Because once we register it, they're not taking it back just because we like the person.
Mhm.
They need to
No,
know that
no,
it was an actual error.
Exactly. Anyway, just,
So, speaking of partnerships and some of that, are we part of the virtual legislation that if we have outstanding tickets, they cannot be their.
It's my understanding that we are now.
We are
I'm
part
going to talk to Kelly about this, my understanding that we are. Eric, do you feel comfortable to say that, or do you want to take that away?
I'll take that away.
Okay, Eric will confirm. I believe we are now on that list.
There's something about this whole conversation that makes me think of, be careful what you wish for. It's,
yeah.
Yeah, I think my one works it off. That one.
Okay, so,
Keep rolling.
all right, this is good.
oh,
Yeah,
the new, guard, emergency guard, you had a meeting on that. So will there be any expenses to municipalities from that, or totally provincial?
It looks like a totally provincial initiative. I will say for the meeting I had, I don't think they have any idea what it's gonna look like, but I don't expect any cost to municipalities. The only challenge may be that right now they're dealing with a lot of overlap with existing emergency services people. And it may create some challenges in terms of availability of emergency services people. If we're using the same people to do ground troops and rescue, fire response, Nova Scotia Guard, all these different levels. There's only one person, so they may sign up for all three, but they can only actually do one. If they've been called off to do something for the province, they're not gonna be available to respond to a local fire call. It's just they're acknowledging most of the volunteers for the guard are the same
Well,
people who
sort
are
of-
already doing emergency response work.
I sort of have a concern when we've been trying to find people for our comfort station, which is a volunteer position. And we haven't had the response we thought we would have.
Yeah,
So,
So one thing we
now
can
we have
find
someone else looking
it's further
for.
pressure for volunteers, and I think
Yeah.
there will be some challenge that way, but in terms of direct costs, I don't expect any direct.
For now.
Yeah, for now, well, you never know where they might go. Yeah.
All right, so on to other protective services, so. Are there any, I know council created a motion to increase the emergency measures budget, so that is in there. And the only other real change that I noted last week was with the new municipal services agreement, there's a GIS and civic addressing costs broken out in section 4 of that agreement. So we incurred costs for it last year, so I budgeted for this year. So are there-
The municipal investment.
yeah, so are there any specific questions on this page? Nope, we're good. All right, I'm gonna take that and move on. All right, so now we're into transportation services, i.e. Public Works. So there's quite a significant amount in this.
Just the news that I emailed was, we'll just put a quick caveat here to explain that because we don't have a separate department, Parks and Recreation. The recreation sheet is also, for the most part, within Public Works. In
Yeah.
particular, the salaries and administration, that stuff is Public Works.
Absolutely.
You said the recreation sheet?
Eventually, there's
The
a
tab.
sheet that is,
Yeah.
all the recreational stuff. And it's structured that way because we structure our stuff around the provincial government's financial reporting structure. So it has a recreation heading. And so we put some stuff under that heading, but I just wanted to note that the stuff under that heading is Public Works. And the stuff under this heading is also Public Works. And we just break it out because the way the province wants us to report on it.
Yeah, so starting on page 46, where we talk about sort of the pool and the parks and that type of thing. That is administered by Public Works, so those expenses would be attributed, but like Dylan said, we do, or CEO said, we do break that out.
So we kind of underreport salaries here
Yeah.
because the salaries
Make it up
there
on
are
that
the same
side.
people.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly, so they're busy. Okay,
They're actually doing a lot more parks stuff these
Yeah.
days because Jonathan's brought a lot more robust inspection regimes in,
Mhm.
which means that we're catching and needing to address things. When we get the capital, I'd like to talk to you about an item that came up after the capital budget was prepared in respect of parks and exactly that. Jonathan noticing things and getting a quotation and it's fairly substantial. We can talk about it.
Shocker, something's expensive.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first section in the Public Works is administrative, and again, I think most of that we've talked about the CPI. And then the benefits and salaries we'll discuss more in closed session. So does anybody have any other questions in regards to the administration side?
Which page, Jan?
Page 25, sometimes 26, maybe
Perfect.
24 to 26 range.
Need to go.
Obviously, the public works office maintenance is a bit of a new line and it's kind of spiking and it'll come back down. It's just. There are obviously, when we do a capital project, as it's been recommended with the old fire hall, then within a year afterwards, there's always small. Things that are determined to be needed in terms of new, shelves and things like that.
Yeah.
So this is a little jump, just because it appeared. Kind of out of nowhere and then it climbed from 500 to 6,000, but it will go back down once we get in the new space.
So no questions in that section. Great, all right, so then we can go down, so the general equipment, you'll notice. It's been consolidated this year, in prior years, it was broken out. Gas, oil, and then for each asset, insurance for each asset and repairs, it just was bogging down the budget, so I've consolidated. Into 3 lines so that we can just sort of clean it up a little bit, they're fairly small lines in the overall budget anyways, so. But I just wanted to make a note there that it looks a little different this year.
So, yeah, what we were finding was that year over year, we were keeping it pretty predictable with respect to the overall line. But because one vehicle needs more maintenance one year, and as a result of getting it, doesn't need it the next, and another year it needs it the next. Rather than giving every vehicle separately, we just aggregated them, and it is a fairly predictable amount across the board, it's just that each vehicle obviously varies quite a bit.
And then we're going down into small tools and workshops and other, if anybody has any questions right there, you'll notice the tree removal has gone up, that's necessary, I think we discussed it last week, Dylan. But that's something that you'll see also on the electric utility for vegetation management, there's quite an expense there.
So you could see last year, we planned to have it climb quite a bit to 20,000. And then due to the hurricane last year and the number of, fairly complex emergency tree removals that came in that period, our actual was quite a bit higher. And as we said, when we mentioned this last time, we're leaving it at that level, but we're really hoping that it will include more proactive work and more planting and less crisis response than it did last year. But obviously that is somewhat weather dependent. We hope we don't have that happen again.
Yeah, seems like the weather is,
But I think that there's such a story to the tree removal and the ditching and culverts lines increasing the way they have. Well, we were all here last year, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that either of those are quite high.
So are there any other questions on anything specific under there? I know roads and streets, there's a couple jumps under salt and in the patching of streets and sidewalks and the culverts and ditching as the CEO just alluded to.
If you're on page 30 or 29. The streetlight expense increase last year caught the scheduled increases, so the actual caught, had fire electrical rate increases to get passed on to street lighting, so that gradually has gone up to 60, which seems accurate based on our electrical rates for this year.
What page are we on?
29.
Okay.
They did use for $50,000 in patching streets. The asphalt plant's confirmed to be opening early, so Jonathan is ready to get it there and get started.
My car thinks.
And you'll see, in terms of asphalt patching and culverts and ditching, there are also capital items in those areas. And so what we kind of did was we took all the small stuff and put it here. And then we broke out a couple of larger pieces, because if you've got one $60,000 culvert, well, the culvert's a ditching of $85,000, it's quite a shock. So that large item would appear on the capital side. And there are a couple.
Yeah, and then the only other thing I'll note is under engineering services and legal on page 30, under traffic service as the title. We have, as I mentioned last week, the 10,000 for the Ernst Brook assessment and the 20,000 for the municipal, give me a sec, municipal specs update.
And I think it's the municipal specs really belongs under traffic service. The Ernst Brook one is just difficult to find a more appropriate home for that expense in the budget. Ultimately, it's going to be in town general. It may be when Ashley eventually does this as a filing with the province, that we find another place to show that that's their water engineering, but ultimately it's just in general.
Can I go back to street lighting?
Yep.
Just, like this past year, we spent 59,300, well, 400 almost. Does that include the new lights that we installed?
No, this is the operating expense.
Oh,
Just to-
okay.
Just to have the power.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just the operating.
The lights we installed should be in the capital budget actual for 23-24.
Yeah.
I'll think double check that they were, but they should be.
That's where they would be.
Are there more to be installed this year, or?
No, we installed all the ones we got the grant for. Now, we did say that we could always do a future expansion of those lights up Main Street, because they're only in the core downtown.
Right.
But that wasn't planned, so that would have to be a separate one.
So yeah, you may have referred to this earlier, but I didn't quite catch it, but. If when we get to the capital budget, if any of those projects are not approved. How would that affect the operational budget?
So there, we will get to essentially the fiscal services sheet and the capital allocation note there at the end of the operating budget show the interaction with the two. It really doesn't affect anything in terms of operating to balance, but it really does come back on the status of funds. So basically, things will flow through operating, but none of them are funded from operating. So you'll see on the status of funds that the various reserve balances are reduced in respect to capital. So if we remove capital projects or add capital projects, it's the reserve balances that are really influenced by that. You might see some stuff flowing through operating, but it's not actually gonna affect the bottom line. And just one other, I guess, a note on the transportation stuff was, we had been directed to include in the budget signage necessary for the time limited parking. So there's a fair number of additional poles and signs that are needed. That was included on the street signs flags line here on page 31, 32. 31, okay, 31. So that, we jumped that up to $10,000, and that's really intended for putting in new, limited time parking signage.
Okay,
I'm just curious about. The.
you're good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Happy to help. Okay, so if we are, everyone's good in public works, we can move on to public health and welfare, also known as housing and cemetery on page 31-ish, 33-ish, sorry. Possibly 34 for you though.
It almost is
I
here
have
with just cemetery. We all, because there's no longer a housing company.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. So the cemetery grant has increased substantially this year, but we're also increasing the park cemetery. And that will include work done with the trees, and there's expenses that you'll notice on the cemetery sheet when we get to it, or we can jump to it. I'm not sure council's preference, but there's a lot contributed to that and the reason for the increase in the grant to the cemetery.
Suppose in a way, it kind of make, I mean, they're pretty short and their entire impact is on this line. Maybe it makes sense to jump over to the cemetery. But it's now.
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah.
We're rolling along here. Let me find where it's sort of. Okay, so on page 80 and 79. So you'll see on page 79, the park cemetery, the trees and improvements have a $10,000 budget. And then we have for design development for the extension, is that called an extension? I guess, yeah. 12.5. So those two would drive the costs up because substantially just on those two line items.
The first one, the $10,000 is for, I guess we'll say like cost effective expansion within the previously cleared areas. Described, but like towards the top, towards the trail, that section of the cemetery, where we have had giveaways of trees over the years. We're finally to a point where we're going to clear it off and put some of it into use. We don't feel that a complicated plan is required for that, and so that's actually work. But 12.5 is planning to do the much larger phase of expansion that would serve for the next 50 years. And that would be more on the other side, towards the rear, or far end of the cemetery, behind the water. Yeah,
Behind
the pond there on the side, which is, behind past that, yeah. So that's a more complicated project and will hopefully result in a much, more appealing phase of expansion for the cemetery that includes landscaping and other considerations that are, really require thought. And so we have a landscape architect quoted on doing a plan, and it would include some cost estimates that could then, we can figure out what can we afford to do.
are there differential prices for the lots?
There aren't now, but we certainly may consider that if the new section has a differential price when it comes along.
So there's a historical design diagram right outside the council chambers, right here, as you leave the door, and everybody should take a look, so this is really fulfilling that original plan to some degree, and just seeing how the cemetery has evolved over these last 100 years, but I mean, this area has very much always been part of the original script, the original plan. Just unfortunately, we got there. The demand was high enough, inevitably need us to get there.
Where are people going parking then?
We
Nice.
we have Suzanne, all my secret places. Interestingly enough, yesterday I was having a conversation with some folks in Lunenburg about their cemetery, and like they have a very significant differentiated rate for people who live in town versus people who don't live in town, and I mean, that's all something that the cemetery committee is reviewing with the CAO and Ashley next week, whenever the next
As
meeting
soon as
is.
we can get
As soon as we
everything.
can get everything
We
together.
were gonna do it, and then the
Yeah.
power went off. for the whole
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. Anyway, very interesting.
I'm curious, as part of the conversation about this cemetery committee, are there any conversation about different ways of respect to?
There are, we've talked about kind of more green burials. We've talked about,
We've spoken with the local boss concerning specific arrangements that they need.
yeah.
Which mostly I think about expediting processes, but yeah.
Yeah, and you know, just various specific requests about orientation of stones and different, you know, east, west, north and south, and just being very open-minded about we accommodate all faiths and all you know, and all styles. I know that there's a new cemetery opening up in Lunenburg County that's really customized to, you know, birds and the bees, and I'm a bit out of my depth on, but I think it's really just, you know, dig a hole and put me in it versus all of the other accommodations, so.
And as a lot of people are
People are
not looking for a full-size plot these days, we
Yeah.
have also been speaking with Columbaria distributors about that, and identified a couple locations within Park Cemetery that would be appropriate. So it's quite possible that in the coming year, as part of one of these expansion phases, we'll also see columbarium installation. But that's just to be determined. But there's interest, and I think there's it would help accommodate demand in the future. A lot of people aren't looking for full-size slots.
So I think the only other point on this topic is that, I mean, there's a recognition that the tax base is funding some of this long-term plan. And there's also recognition that the historical perpetual care fund, which was woefully underfunded for, you know, only 240 years, we've made a lot of progress. I think when I joined council, we had a $69,000 perpetual care fund, and now we're up to a good hunk of 250 or so. So, I mean, it's a long time process. I think a decade from now, I mean, there's a very real possibility that the perpetual care fund will be robust enough that it will be able to cover the costs. And I think aspirationally, we all want the care fund to fund all of this. So this doesn't come back on the taxpayers. So like right now, I think the town is being very charitable, and hopefully that charitable will lead to a very beautiful public space beyond just a cemetery. It'll be a place for people to walk their dogs and spend time. It's almost like a park, but in the short term, meaning the next decade, there'll probably be an ongoing requirement, not to this extent, but an ongoing subsidization to hopefully we get to a point where we don't need the town's funding.
Capital works being funded from perpetual care,
Right.
obviously is something that's probably not likely to happen.
No,
But this year, in the actual 23-24, you'll notice we actually got pretty much the 50% operating funded from interest on the care reserve. So that was a big job. Like, we're really making a lot of progress towards that notion that the interest alone on perpetual care deposits, whether that's interest paid by other town departments or interest through a bank or whatever, will be enough to support the operating of the cemetery. If there's improvements to be made coming out of this plan, and it's gonna have capital costs.
Yeah.
You know, those are certainly still going, as Joe said, to be town costs.
and there'll be a lot of consultation when we get out of this.
So this is a little bit of a sideways question about increasing the number of plots.
Mhm.
But then if the regular size plots be divided into two.
So the regular plots,
For actions.
I'm not an expert, but I think you can have up to 4, in terms of actions, so you are allowed to.
Oh, I see, you
Yeah.
can already do
Yeah.
that, but are they sold as one?
They're still
Or-
sold, yeah, you can't buy the little ones, and I think that's because of the proliferation of headstones. If they're different owners, whereas if you get different, you typically have one shared headstone and multiple interments, so you wouldn't be able to fit 4 headstones on the.
But they could be small headstones.
There may be some.
It's a subdivision issue.
So for every one plot, 6 by 8 plot, you can put 4 cremations.
Yeah.
Or one.
Even 3, 6, yeah, yeah.
But the presumption is one owner, Joe, and so Penny was asking,
Yeah.
could 2 owners split that, and is there a way to accommodate that, and. We've talked about it when cemetery committee meetings. So
Yeah,
Let me get Bob's opinion on that, dude.
hey, they're,
He actually digs the grave.
plots are for sale at the town hall. You need one, come get one.
My uncle, I have 2 aunts and uncles who share a double plot. And it belonged to the one, and they shared their plot with my uncle and his wife, so,
Are they on one headstone?
no, 2
Is it
separate
two
heads.
separate?
But it's a
Yeah,
double
it's a
plot.
plot.
Okay.
It's a double plot.
Double.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, I mean, thank you,
It's
guys.
a lot of territory for one small urn of ashes.
And that's also where the columbarium will
Yeah.
probably be appealing to people.
It is.
Yeah, but the ground is, well, I don't know, anyway.
Most of the spaces have been made for coffins though, in the, like, in
The
the
old
older
steel.
plot, right? So you could put more.
And one thing we might do is, thinking of that headstone subdivision question with the expansion section. Make a part that kind of is more half-sized lots,
Mini lots.
so we can look at that. I don't think any of it will change the budget allocation of it.
Well, I guess going down that to the interest of with this and the public health and welfare. I was thinking extended. I think.
yeah,
It is a type of housing,
My-
afterlife housing.
But yeah, my, I guess, probably,
Ah.
especially in my head, would be for a town that actually really struggles with real estate. We've given a lot of good real estate to
cemetery.
the cemetery, and so that conversation at some point, maybe not in my lifetime, but at some point might be had whereby. We have people struggling with somewhere to live, and we have folks who are very comfortable and they're long gone. Very large spaces.
And we can mention the land use bylaw actually did
Yeah,
limit cemeteries to the existing footprint of the cemetery.
Yeah.
So in that sense, but yeah, we're still working within the existing footprint of Park Cemetery.
But it's a big footprint.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
so are you suggesting that some of that land could go to housing, is that what? Or could go to something?
Depending on our priorities, right? So it's, for me, it's a case of.
You already mentioned many lots. Say that what we do.
Well, we're getting pretty close to Hawthorne Hill.
If we think about just the infrastructure we have, the amount of land we have at the time. In relation to where people are living, and where people who are long gone are living,
Mhm.
it's quite a huge. Spread, so the cemetery there, and that cemetery, that's quite a huge spread for a very small town, but.
When we talked about the discussion around paving Park Street, is that what we call that street now, Park Street? And then, that land was subdivided and there's a building lot, I think, on the, fire hall side of that road. And with the other 2 projects developed, so, I mean, there will be a time when if we are ripping up the street, and putting in services to support that those housing lots that,
It's very late. Very late.
mhm.
It's pretty well on spot.
Anyway.
So probably just from a budgetary perspective,
Yeah.
you mentioned there are 2 cemeteries, we only talked about Park. I think it's because from actually my perspective, there really is very little talk about Bayview.
Yeah.
It's not an active cemetery, so it's covering about, again, half of the operating costs out of, investment income and the remainder through a grant from the town. And that's intended to ensure we put as much into professional care as possible. And, we'll hopefully reach, as Joe said, a self-sustaining point in the future. It is harder with, Bayview because we're not selling lots, so the professional care is not growing by anything other than the town contributing to it.
Well said, well said. Okay, and then the housing part of this, I suppose,
Back on page what?
33.
Okay.
I just wanted to mention, we mentioned this last week, but the regional housing, the Minister of Municipal Affairs sent out a letter saying that we're no longer required to contribute to it, so that saves us some money. And the housing initiatives, the $30,000 has changed from the $30,000 in the prior year budget. This year it is for the assessment of properties at Hawthorne and Kimburn for housing. So it's different than what we had, the 30,000 pinged for last year's budget, but still 30,000, just,
Yeah, by coincidence.
yeah,
And
so,
this 30,000, as you'll recall, represents 50% of the cost to assess the property on the properties, I should say, on Hawthorne and Kimburn. And we were going to receive 50% from CMHC via our partnership with the Mahone Bay Land Cooperative.
okay. So if there's nothing else on that, we can move on to the next page, which is Community Services Environmental Development. So that's page 34. Are there any specific questions? I'm not sure.
Health services and advertising is back down to what is more of a sort of traditional level.
Yeah,
After having gone on due to some specific projects and initiatives in the past couple of years. And accessibility, same thing. We mentioned this the other day, I think, but it's come down. Because we completed a series of accessibility audits last year. They were externally funded, but the town's contribution was in here. And I think actually we've got the unaudited actual in there. So we need to look at, because we did get some funding for half of that. We're showing, I think we're showing the net. I don't think we're showing the net.
We're showing it gross?
We're showing
Okay.
gross cost.
let me take a look.
But that's in last year. So for this year, it's just the salary, our share of the regional coordinator, Ellen, and then $5,000 for initiatives that we would have within the, realms other than physical infrastructure improvement. So services here in the office, digital services, that type of thing. We have a number of commitments in our accessibility action plan. The $5,000 here is to help facilitate some of those action in these years.
How are those shared positions, this one and the new diversity position? Apportioned to the 5 municipalities.
I cannot recall if it's assessment basis or a combination of assessment and other factors. I'm looking there, but you may not know either.
I don't have a
Yeah.
definite answer, but it is certainly prorated
Prorated.
from some sort of formula.
Intended to be proportional, but I know we ran scenarios using assessment,
Yeah.
population, combinations thereof. And I think it's the same basis for the two coordinators, I think in the end, but yeah, every time we do this, we run all the different formulas and it spits out a slightly different number from a home bay. Ours tend to be within $100, give or take. It's not a big difference, but MODL makes a big difference off it, so they're the ones who usually have that, consideration.
Okay, are there any other questions in this section? It's a pretty small section. Going once, going twice?
And that's for a 5-minute break,
Absolutely.
2 hours.
I love that.
Five-minute break is. Telling me break.
Or do you gonna leave it stream, but we just mute stuff, or we?
That's up to council. What would you prefer me do?
Sure.
Just mute those. So everybody, bring your screen off if you want it off.
Mine's already off somehow.
Back on.
We're back.
And the little pause that,
We are,
so it's really complicated.
yeah, so our next section, if everyone is good with our discussions, is wastewater or environmental services. So that's around page 37.
You can make a video on that.
So my video is on. I don't know, it kind of blacked out a while ago and I've tried it and my computer does not want me to be seen, so. I'm hearing voice only.
When you didn't add another $1,500 laptop.
Sorry.
Where are we gonna?
So we are on page 37. Yeah. Okay.
And So it is interesting the way it's appearing now, so can we confirm that the sound is going out before we start talking?
I can ask,
And just what I'm used to seeing is I'm used to seeing Mahone Bay as the little screen that is black but lights up the show we're talking and it's not
Right.
up there, so. I mean, it's on my screen, which is not up there.
It says Mahone Bay is talking. It does look different. 1 second.
I mean, it's quite possible that YouTube changed or Zoom did the way that it chooses to show or not show.
So this is on my other computer and you said. It says Mahone Bay is.
Thank you. Great, so we're live and we're on 37.
wonderful. Okay, so, just trying to see here if there's anything specific we want to discuss. On page 38, so the following page. The under sewage treatment and disposals, there's.
You were thinking about.
Yeah.
To the 7 for the thing.
Yeah.
The change. A significant change in climate and environmental initiatives. We're not saying it's just conference attendance.
We didn't talk about anything for this meeting.
Did I skip
I
it?
think, yeah, we were supposed to.
Sorry.
Community services and environmental development.
Okay, page 35.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And okay.
And now what was your question?
Yeah, climate and environmental initiative, which was huge jump in budget and it's
Yeah.
all based on this concept of attendance by.
as well as we didn't receive funding for one of the summer interns that we will have, so we have to now fund that fully. So it's the cost of attending the conferences as well as the intern funding.
Yeah, I think the shortfall on the intern was clearly not expected, we just found out that. But we had already bumped it up a little bit, and I wouldn't have said just the conference attendance, but just generally about the small initiatives that we've had the opportunity to sign on to, so we're participating in a number of small regional initiatives like the clean climate capacity effort, for example, within the BL and the City Foundation. So we've got a couple of small initiatives that have small operating contributions associated that are in there.
Yeah,
And then the biggest difference is, this is the line that shows the summer students, and we have only one of the 2 grants that we normally get. It would show as a net, like this is a net number, so we don't show the external funding for summer students somewhere, we just show the net impact of it.
So that note needs to be.
Amanda?
You better go.
Yes.
Sure.
Because I can sort of see somebody. Just thinking.
Yeah.
It's too much.
And most of the conferences Lauren goes to, she went to last year, we were invited to, and they paid the cost.
Yeah.
So like, she's going to talk about our great stuff, but often we're not actually paid for
And
it.
she's contributing a lot to those conferences. A lot of times she's speaking at them, isn't she? She's really.
Yeah, and they'll
involved
usually
in
pay
that.
because she went to Toronto for one last year, and it's, it's great, we want to talk about what Mahone Bay's doing, but if you want us to come to Toronto, talk about what Mahone Bay's doing, probably you can pay for it.
Thank you.
Now back to wastewater. So Ashley, I'm I'm hoping I'm not saying something out of turn here, but I wanted to say that because it's in the fourth quarter. I was gonna say the wastewater would be reflective of the share of the new staff person that we've been talking
Yep.
about. It's public, this is not confidential.
Yep.
That we were told by our system assessment report for the water utility that we should have 3 people because of sick leaves and standby, and we having 3 people is a vulnerability. In the past, we plugged it with contractors, but ultimately that wasn't really saving us much money. And it was leaving us with a shortfall where you couldn't get a contractor and we didn't have a person, and it would all fall down to whichever employee was on shift to work, sometimes as much as more than a month of standby coverage. So I just wanted to note that there's a portion, 40%
Yeah,
of
and,
staff are wastewater, because we share all the staff.
we
so
implemented them
late
coming
in the year,
halfway through the year, yeah.
See, there's a small increase in here, but there is a permanent staff person in here.
Yeah.
Shared with water at kind of a 60-40 on the water side.
Yeah.
And it's just that it's not expected to begin until after council approves the water rate study. So we put it in here, but ultimately we put it as halfway through the year, knowing the water rate study will be presented to you by July. And then if we approve proceeding with a water application, we've got the funds in here to cover the wastewater share of that employee. So we just wanted to note.
Yep,
and
no,
it
that's a
doesn't
great
look like
point.
a book. I think it's important to break it in.
It
It
doesn't
doesn't look like a person because it's halfway through the year and it's 40% of a person.
Yeah.
Oh, that page.
It's 37, 38, 37, 38. Yeah.
Oh,
Well, it shows a little bit on 38 or 37 and a little bit on 38 because their salaries are broken down. Again, this is how the provincial reporting structure works,
Yeah.
but they want to show what portion of the salary is about collection of sewer and what part is about treatment of sewer.
Yeah,
But obviously, we don't have different staff, we're small, we don't have different staff doing those things. So Ashley just breaks the cost.
divided all out, yeah, but that's a great point, actually. And then continuing on page 38, the sewage treatment and disposal, we had planned to do a self-redraining of sludge last year. It didn't end up happening, so we're planning on doing that for $18,000 this year. So it's the same project, just carried forward to this year. And I think the CAO mentioned last week that this is something that you have to do every 10 years-ish or something, and we're at that point, so it's.
You have to do it every 10 years,
Oh.
and we're at the 30-year mark.
Oh, well, there you go, so we're due.
The good news is it wasn't because it was being neglected, it was because the projections on the accumulation of sludge were conservative. And we monitor it, and we only now feel that we've reached where we could have been in 10 years. And mostly that's because when you're considering a volume of wastewater effluent, you have kind of a standard percentage of it that's gonna be solids that could sediment that could create sludge. But because of the massive amount of stormwater infiltration in our system, ours doesn't have that percentage of sediment, so the lagoons were built to a certain scale, but the water going through them is much more water than otherwise, so that's why it took us longer to get to that level of sludge. So some advantages of all that infiltration, it's
All right, good sludge talk. So,
podcasting.
yeah. And then on page 39, under garbage and waste collection, our trucking costs have increased. There's an extended agreement for 18.23%, so that is built into there. So I just want to make a note on there about that.
And that was discussed back in December, but after some careful consideration, it was decided that all of the municipal joint service board units with our hauler contacts would get a 2-year extension rather than going to the market now. And even though we accepted an 18% increase overall over the course of 2 years, we did feel that it was a good value, and that determination was made regionally, not this now.
Are there any questions on this section?
So just to clarify, the contract is 3 years, right?
Yeah, it was a 2 years.
Extension.
Yeah.
So this year and next year. And next year it increases, I think it was 5.5. It wasn't as much, but not much of an increase. Oh, another quick note on this page, just because it's of interest on page 39, 3,040 for Francis and I, is the public area waste collection disposal increase in the actual from year over year. So we often put out new waste receptacles, and there's costs associated with that on the back end in terms of collection. So there's been an increasing proliferation of public waste receptacles and dog bag receptacles lives around town, and I know we've got a lot of good public feedback on that, but. You know, this is just making sure it's known that we also pay a contractor to come pick up that garbage, and so that cost has increased as well.
If there are no other questions, I would ask everyone to please go to page 46 for rec and culture. So this is, as the CEO alluded earlier, this is sort of the tie into the public works. So the salaries and the benefits, that all of that pertains to public works individuals.
Is it real?
46?
47.
Okay, pass this on.
I skipped over fire, because I
Yes,
thought we
yeah,
could.
Makes sense. You
Yeah.
should, So
Okay,
we've got the new sports field operation line, and then also the swimming pool operation line that has been around for some time, and now that we've decided to get the swimming pool up and running for the season. Both of those facilities are included there,
yes, very excited for the swimming pool.
and most of everything included in recreation and cultural services is what we later describe in the subsidy schedule.
Yeah.
It's essentially, the subsidies are the town paying a third party to deliver a service to our residents. That's how we define a subsidy. Why is it a subsidy? We're providing these things. We're not actually asking for a specific product to be provided. We're contributing to them to deliver on their mandate, to provide services to our residents. So these are not a fee for service. These are a contribution, but they are in respect of providing services to our residents.
So are there any questions on this page?
Well, how does that contribution work? I mean, how do we decide how much?
All of these pretty much are subject to specific agreements that we've made with specific organizations. Now, in the case of the one that we just made today with the motion around the Lunenburg County Wheels, sometimes, you know, we basically dictated the terms. In some cases, we've negotiated a written agreement with both parties signing off on the agreement, such as with the Mahone Bay United around the field operation. The pool societies would go back, you know, even further. I'm not entirely sure what document underlay the agreement that the pool society would operate the pool on behalf of the town. But that was so long ago that it's always been that way. Yes, they're kind of case by case as to whether they're based on a written agreement or historical practice or just a decision of council with a set time frame.
Yeah, I was thinking more of the next section, the cultural buildings and facilities. And what is the heritage properties?
That's the grant, that's just. the
Well,
property.
that's the grant.
Yeah, so that's not on the subdivision sheet, that's just here, but most of these are also on the subdivision, so some of them are, so that's one that's not. But the library, the regional library, for example, is like, we're compelled, to my knowledge, to make that contribution.
Oh.
Whereas the museum, we agreed to make.
Yeah.
Historically, but not. Yeah, I'm not sure how the regional library's funding originally began, but I'm pretty sure. we
Because
have
the libraries off.
Yeah. okay, take it, it's like-
So I see those items, are all. Most of them are basically, you take a one was unaudited last fiscal and just put in, there's no percentage increase. So like the regional library, 78.
So what, sorry, let me get here. So the regional library, yeah, so, I based it off, because our budget's getting earlier, there's not a lot of, some of, like the RCMP and stuff, I'm not able to get sort of a ballpark idea of what we're gonna pay, so I base it off of 78, but it's been actual 78 for a couple years, so I thought I'd be comfortable going with that.
The museum one is, it's an action, it's based on actuals year end, so that it'll match up revenue to expense the net itself out, because it's basically, it's us giving them a grant in perspective what we.
That's for the utilities and it's for, so whatever, yeah, so that'll balance out at the end,
So
but,
it's
yeah,
not even really 8,850.
no, it can,
Whatever. it is, so they're-
yeah, exactly, so, but. Yeah, so it's kind of one of those best guess scenario based on history,
Plus they get tax exemption, right?
correct? Okay, so if there are no more questions on rec and culture, we can go to education and fiscal services and transfers, which is on page 50.
I just see the line item in the operating budget.
I guess it starts on page 49, sorry. So, the education, same type of deal. Last year I was able to get an estimate from them, but just the timing of the budget getting being produced earlier, they didn't have one available at this point, so best guess.
The one thing we know is they froze their contributions to us more than 5 years ago. They certainly haven't frozen our contributions.
Yeah, it's a one-way
And
relationship.
Joe often points out here, we really need some time to clean this up. It's, you know, we should be doing a careful look through exempted properties to determine whether the ratios we used here are accurate reflections of the exempted assessment, because the formula here that they use to determine this is meant to leave certain things out. And we've kind of noticed a couple times that it didn't seem to be the way it was supposed to be. And we just haven't really had the time to circle back around and do a deep dive into that, but considering it keeps coming up, it is, you know, worthwhile to just make sure we're not leaving any money on the table there. I think it was the public comfort stations, perhaps.
In the
Yeah,
Public Works Building.
okay, well, but,
Well, that's the thing, you know, they, I mean. Together, they add up to a pretty reasonable big assessment, so you just don't want them in the calculation. Drives $2,000 in policing, $6,000 in some other costs, just because of the, just because it's there, yeah. Well, I think there's a note you could just say if it's a core town asset used for core. So for example, the fire department building, the new public works building would need to be part of the core town operations, and therefore it's exempt,
Exempt, okay.
but these things happen over years and years and years. So the fire department, so the building in Bahamas, and you'd be surprised how big an assessments on that. Not that
I say building loosely too, right?
yeah, no, it's real money.
Sounds like it's worth doing.
We're tripping down.
And then, I have included a note, not on the Virgin, you all have, for the debt charges, I did break it out into a note on exactly what was within that 141,000. So you'll have that on a revised version next Friday. I wanted to make the changes with anything that came from here, so we didn't get into 3 or 4 versions going around.
It'll be especially good because I don't know about everybody else, but the one Brandon and I are looking at has 55,000 and then it totals to 141 without showing the lines that total. You know, I know they're in there, you just hit them. I hadn't noticed that when we were PDFing it, and sometimes Ash and I are looking at versions where the things are unhidden. And then it goes to PDF and they get hidden.
It's just, yeah.
And you just want to catch that because obviously it's a little weird that there's no math leading to the
The
141.
math is not working.
Yeah.
That is a nightmare for me,
So
so.
those,
Well, it was much scarier when at first I thought it just was missing, and then I realized it was in the total, so we're not short on.
No, it's there, yeah. So that basically, the three debentures for that is the principal on the fire station that the fire department wasn't able to absorb this year, so the balance there of 86,000 for the total principal, the Claremont Pleasant Street sewer debenture and the Kinburn Street Bridge debenture, so the main driver there is the 86,000 for the fire station. And I have that in a note now, so that'll be more clear.
and that, we're on page 49.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so under debt charges, that principal
Yeah.
is the 141, so it's 86 for the fire station, 40 for Claremont and Pleasant, and 15 for Kinburn.
And
Those are
the
all
Claremont was only 2017, so that's gonna be going a while yet.
Yeah.
When was the Kindergarten Bridge one?
I,
It might be good when you get a note to put when you could amends.
yeah, sure, I
So-
can message it.
Is that the full, that's not the full debt charge of
No.
all of our.
No.
So I got on that line in it, so are we funding this out of operations, or is this coming,
So
is this coming
yeah,
from the
this is-
capital line?
Yeah, this is coming off the capital, so the
This-
capital allocation sheet, is that in here? Is that in this version? No, it's not.
Yeah.
Oh, it is?
uh,
If it isn't, maybe
It
it's.
should be, yeah, because it is in there, but the 141 was missing because the reference.
Page
so-
82, Joe?
So it says, when it says it has all the income and then the expense, where it says last principal debt charges, there is a link break there, so that should have the 141, 123 in there.
Mhm.
It goes to other.
No, it didn't have.
It didn't.
But-
Geez, you and I even have different.
No, so I got.
Oh, the printout version versus the one on the screen, okay. Yeah, because I've got it in the one I have.
So, but our debt,
Going home.
actually, just so we're on the same page here, though. So our debt schedule is now, our principal payments are down to 141. Am I on page 49?
Yeah, and that excludes the fire department and what's being paid from there on with fire, and it excludes water or electrical
Yeah.
debt, but I don't think the electrical utility has any.
The water does, but
Yeah.
yes, so there's a couple debentures still in play for.
This would be-
We haven't actually borrowed in the last number of years, we keep buying.
But these are all the
Mhm.
the debt schedules that we've had, all the, including the rollover from last year.
Yeah.
And it's down to 141.
For the town. Remember, there's still some in water as well,
Oh, yeah, okay.
and then there's some in fire, so.
So when you roll out the debt schedule that added up. Like I was like historically it was 215.
Mm.
You're prorating that between
I think
town
the fire is what you're
and
missing.
something else.
Yeah, the fire is what you're missing on that number, Joe, I think.
If you want, I can actually provide you a debt schedule next Friday, just with a list of all our debts and when they're gonna
Yeah,
expire,
but
would that help?
I think, yeah, I think you've
Okay.
done that in the past.
Yeah.
So the salient point, this is back to our conversation about the infrastructure charge, like all of these payments are being financed and funded from the capital sources. And we put those policies in place years ago when we had lots of funding. But that was pre no more area dividend. And it was also at a time when, I don't know, we've also scaled back the D-transfer tax assumption.
Yep.
Around volume, so just think about this, so we're charging D-transfer tax and we're getting $175,000. We're getting no more area dividend, we're getting the $300,000 from the infrastructure charge. But almost all of that is being absorbed by the debt. And so just like it's not as fruitful as it was before, because we've also made these decisions to fully fund the equipment reserve by $100,000 a year. So all I'm saying is I wonder if we're still in surplus there, if these debt schedules is the 141 the only thing come out of the capital? I guess is the point.
Yeah.
It
So
is.
that's page 82 is your capital
Okay.
allocation. 141 comes out of $523,000
okay.
for capital. So
Okay.
it's not that much of the 523.
I think, like the debt scale, because there's only a couple more big MFC financing loans, I think, Ashley, aren't they? Like we're down to the last 2 or 3.
Yes, but we
That
are
are
going.
upcoming, 'cause
We are going
upcoming,
to add several
yeah,
more.
No, fair enough,
yeah,
but not necessarily on town,
not on town,
not in
yeah.
town general.
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah, the water wastewater projects, half of them will be on town, right? But the other water and because the wastewater.
Mhm.
So that's the biggest thing on it.
The only reason I'm talking about it now is because we've lived a long time in this town with all of the capital funding from these 4 other sources, not tax bills. And I think those days are coming to a quick end. And just be like, we're as a council moderating property tax rates, fair enough, like, and I think we can do that for a year, but we gotta understand that there's a bunch of costs coming at us. They'll have to get funded from somewhere, and if we don't have these other sources, like, we'll have to get it from the tax base, so just that. It's gonna be more difficult to keep taxes flat unless we get lots of growth, which let's hope we do. I'm not,
And, what we've set ourselves up for doing it this way is that essentially. We know that this is the room to absorb future borrowing principal and interest payments. We pretty much have those payments in the next 10 years, and we keep going in, buying things, building things,
Mhm.
It's gonna reduce this number, as Joe says, down to the point where. it's great that we've got room to handle all those principal interest payments, but there won't be any further contributions to reserve coming out of this number.
Right,
Had we been contributing more money to the reserves earlier, we might not have borrowed, and we might have found ourselves in the position where this was a more sustainable source of funding. But by not increasing it earlier, by taking the time and kind of seeing how things went, we've required ourselves to pay for stuff from borrowing, which is further narrowing that space to stop that trend. So we're kind of required to keep going back to borrowing because of that, and gradually creating a sort of like a structural imposition on our budget that would eventually, to Joe's point,
Mhm.
actually eliminate all of the non-operating funding to capital and just turn that into debt covering.
Mhm.
No other way around it but to make a big decision at some point to create the money to get ahead of the borrowing by doing projects with money we already have.
It would be helpful if it blows a lot more wind, there's a lot more wind next year.
Yes,
Will help as well.
I would say we
The
don't.
wind
I
farm.
mean, all of these things can come up and come down, and you know, there are better years and worse years, and last year wasn't great for a couple of these. But ultimately, what we've done is still we've set up a situation where, because we're borrowing first and paying for the stuff later, this is gonna get more and more chewed up in borrowing costs, and we've already approved projects that this will be impacted on.
I guess the good news is that our historical borrowing, which is moderate, was super cheap. Like the interest rates are 2.3 to 3.5, 1.4 to 3, 0.6 to 1, because they're all on an upward sliding scale. So eventually you run out of the cheap debt and then you have more expensive debt. I guess we just have to be ready for that.
Yeah, that's exactly.
And as you always know, you know, we're in a better position than a lot of towns where if you decide to borrow to do needed capital work, the borrowing payments on that are actually coming at the expense of operating costs. We're not actually there yet, where we're struggling to make ends meet and do capital because of the forward-thinking allocation of a considerable amount of funding to capital. It's just that the way we set it up, there is a point at which that will catch up to us. And we may need to consider increasing the contribution above and beyond these dedicated funding sources.
Now, when Councillor Carver and I spoke yesterday, she wanted to have a discussion on the low income property subsidy, which is the next section down below under tax and other general administrative services. The same page, yeah, just the low income property subsidy. So it's broken out in the note, and it's the same note as you've seen last year. Basically breaks it out between household income and then the rebate that applies to it. And I don't know if Councillor Carver wanted to speak to it, or do you want me to continue?
Well, given how tight everything is getting, and tighter and tighter for everybody. Wondered about the possibility of increasing the rebates and or changing the income levels for eligibility. So Daphne and I talked about the possibility of just increasing the rebates by a couple of $100 each round. I noticed that Modal had increased their is it their minimum eligibility income was 50,000, is that right? Is that- maximum, that would be their maximum.
Yeah, I think it was, yeah.
So, we last changed this 2 years ago. So a lot has changed economically in the world. So I'm just putting it out to the council to think about what kind of figures we might want to entertain. The changing that.
Grossing up the inclusion rates by that percentage by inflation certainly seems reasonable as a starter. You know, so $30,000 today is equals to last year was 8%. What was our CPI last year?
7.6.
So 7.6 plus, let's call it 4 for the sake of conversation, 11%.
So, it doesn't say in here what so the qualifying amount is still 40,000?
The qualifying amount is, well, it depends, right? If you're less than 30, you get a certain rebate, and then
Oh.
40 is the max, 40 is.
So you just look at the MODL, like their maximum credit is still quite small compared to ours at 850 or 650. But the qualifying amount is 51,850, so we've got people in that category, you know, we wouldn't be giving anything. Right. The maximum we give out is still quite a bit more than the maximum they would give out. So if you wanted to mirror the way they're going, you wouldn't change the numbers, you just change the qualifying amount. So our grants would still be 250, 500, 1,000, but we just increase who would qualify. We'd say instead of being greater than 40,000, it'd be greater than 45,000. I think it goes percent, 11%, that would be 45,000. I think in the past, I suggested linking this to a number that the census says is Mahone Bay's median income.
Yeah.
And then saying 75% of Mahone Bay's median income. But I think probably 46,000 is about 75% of Mahone Bay's median income. If I remember correctly, from the last census.
So it's suggesting to increase the, rather than increase the rebates, increase the.
Yeah.
On the
45. To 45,000 versus 40.
So then each bracket would change, is that right?
Yeah, so we just have to decide how we want the bracket to change. Do we want it to still be less than 30 out of 1,000 and then just spread the others out? Like the way it is now, it's. Oh, wait, great, yeah.
Or
greater
those
than-
are 5,000 brackets.
Yeah, so we could just move the brackets and say 40 to 45, or we could make the bracket 7,500. And then keep the less than 30 at 1,000, does that make sense for? We're saying, so we have 45 down to 37,500, 250, 37,500 down to 3,500, less than 30 is still 1,000, so we're just stretching who is eligible. Rather than moving the 1,000 up to 35.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds good.
I think that. That's it.
Yes.
And I think in the end, like, we probably don't, we'll run the numbers, but we probably don't need a huge increase in the actual. We already, we're gonna take it up to 32,
Yeah.
knowing the actual is 28. We might wanna bump it up more like 35, 36 based on this, we can go back and talk before next week's draft.
Just look at,
It's not that big of a change, because it's just, at the end of the day, the actual is, we'll best guess, if people qualify. Maybe we're wrong, maybe it's more than we thought, we're just trying to come up with a guess once we set the numbers.
So, sorry, I was trying to figure out the top range, but less than, are we reducing that, less than 30, or are we maintaining the?
So we're
30?
saying less than 30 is 1,000,
Okay.
30 to 3750 is 500,
Yeah.
3750 to 45,000 is 250, greater than 45,000 is
Yeah.
0.
Perfect.
And then it'll just, even I can look at, you know, who didn't make the cut, who might make the cut. Now they're gonna be getting 250s, those people who barely made the cut, or who might have now shifted from 250 to 500. And if $5,000 is enough, which is, we already had increased it over actual, but so I think we. probably
Yep,
have-
absolutely. I can do a little.
At the end of the day, if this brings all more people in the door than we thought, we never know for sure.
Yeah.
We'll just have a higher actual than we thought.
And this is household income?
Or
Yes.
household
This is
income, yeah.
So you'll bring back the figures next time.
Yeah, so I'll do an analysis on what was actually applied for versus what would be applied for if we had shifted the criteria. Yeah, no problem.
just the only other consideration would be if all of the participants fell into the lowest bracket. Then you'd say, well, you'd be better off making 1,000, 1,200. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
that for whatever the analysis is, depending.
And of course.
You want to provide-
It is only up to your taxes paid,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Positive.
So this is a cautionary note, because the actual applications may not reflect the real need.
No, fair enough.
So, and by having the availability of the options might over time encourage people to apply, so. But by decreasing the options, it would discourage people. It's, yeah, or by applying it only to the lowest bracket. You would be functionally discouraging people from applying. if that makes sense.
But I do think you're right that, we're gonna see an increase in applications, even if we don't change anything, because there were people who qualified who didn't apply. And now that they're dealing with more pressures in their lives, they might be looking for something this year, but, So, yeah, we'll probably see an increase even regardless of people who qualify.
Yeah, we've seen an increase on the electrical utility on payment plans, so it's, and we're happy to see that people are taking advantage of that, so.
And we do always point out to somebody if they're coming in with trouble with paying electrical or water, at least have you're not a homeowner, but have you applied for the low income tax relief, because at least that's something we
It's
can
something
offer.
extra, yeah, exactly,
And I know that there are renters who pay one and don't qualify to get it.
yeah. Fair point. Okay, are there any other questions on the fiscal services tab? Sorry, not tab, I'm an Excel sheet. I'll forever be an Excel lover, I'm sorry.
So we left those
Yeah.
reserve transfers at the levels that we discussed last year, the bigger town equipment reserve transfer, for example.
Yeah.
And then if we're at the end of fiscal services, that means we're at the end of town general.
Yes,
And so before talking about whether we want to get into fire or capital or utilities, I think it would make sense to probably have a closed session.
that would be my
on
suggestion,
operating.
yep, we'll go right
And
into it.
then I know there's at least one tidbit that we want to come back to today on fire. We'll just kind of see how long the closed session takes and then.
Yeah.
Release them.
What's that, more than one session? Moved by Councilor Fava, seconded by Councilor Now, on the question. First section.
We'll find out, but I would prefer you to just